The medieval world is often romanticized in stories, but it was a harsh reality for the majority of people. The social structure of the time was akin to a multi-layered cake, rich at the top but heavy and dense at the bottom. Of course, most people were stuck somewhere in the middle of that cake, wishing they could at least lick the frosting. In a world where your birth defined your entire life, breaking free from the predetermined layers was as likely as finding a peasant on the throne or a knight making his own bread. The monarch, the puppeteer of everything and nothing. Let's start at the top, shall we? The monarch, king, queen, or whatever title floated your golden boat, was the head of everything. But despite the grandeur, being a king wasn't always the Netflix binge-worthy experience it's made out to be. Sure, they wore a crown, but the throne was more of a pressure cooker. Imagine sitting on an ancient electric chair that could fire at any moment if your enemies were clever enough. The monarch was the richest person in the kingdom, yet they were constantly playing political chess, often at the mercy of their nobles and church, and sometimes even an invading neighbor who decided this was the year to wreck your land. Take King John of England, who famously signed the Magna Carta in 1215, not because he was a cool, progressive guy who believed in people's rights, but because his nobles basically forced him to after he nearly bankrupted the kingdom. There was very little of the glamorous power we think of today. It was more like running on a tightrope where one misstep sent you hurtling into a war, a coup, or a lovely poison-filled cup of wine delivered by someone with a smirk. The monarch often faced betrayal from within the court, noble revolts and religious disputes that could get them excommunicated from the church. The ultimate medieval, you're canceled.
I'm Bart Simpson. Who the hell are you?
Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm the devil! And you've earned eternal damnation for your lifetime of evil deeds, Bart.
Their decisions were as fragile as the parchment they signed, and their wealth as fickle as the loyalty of their subjects. Yes, they had absolute power, but absolute power meant having everyone around you absolutely want to take it. Nobility, lords, ladies, and power-drunk warriors. Below the monarch were the nobles, lords, ladies, and barons, basically the kingdom's aristocratic gatekeepers. Imagine them like the high society hosts of an exclusive, never-ending dinner party, always dressed in finery, but constantly looking over their shoulders, fearing that one wrong toast could get them booted from the event. Their estates were their tickets to stay relevant, but they were also a constant source of stress, like owning a yacht you can't really afford, hoping no one notices the leaks. The nobles were given fiefs, land grants by the king, which they were supposed to manage. In theory, this meant collecting taxes from the peasants and raising armies for the king. But in practice, being a lord was like juggling fine china while walking a tightrope, balancing the exploitation of peasants below while keeping the king above appeased. The entire feudal system was a bit like a high-stakes poker game. If you were noble, you were betting with big chips, unless your peasants were starving or there was a plague, in which case everyone lost and your castle couldn't keep out the disease or the wolves. They spent their time hosting grand feasts, drinking expensive wine, and praying the king wouldn't demand more soldiers or higher taxes. But don't let the silk robes fool you. These weren't just party planners. A medieval lord was often a warrior too, leading his men into battle. Imagine a high society aristocrat, dressed to the nines, suddenly grabbing a sword to defend his mansion from burglars. It sounds absurd, but that was medieval warfare, the elite putting their fortunes on the line, sword in hand, defending what they believed was rightfully theirs. Knights. The warrior bureaucrats of feudal Europe. Ah, the knight, the poster child of medieval glamour. A brave, chivalrous warrior mounted on a horse brandishing a sword with honor. Right? Wrong. Knights were more like armored thugs with a code of conduct written by poets with overactive imaginations. Yes, some knights followed the code of chivalry, but let's not pretend they weren't also tax collectors, landowners, and political pawns. Knighthood was a complicated gig. You were both a soldier and a bureaucrat. Sure, you might save a damsel in distress, but more often you were bashing heads for a noble's tax collection. Knights were the muscle of the feudal system, armored and dangerous, and they were expensive. Armor wasn't cheap, and a good horse could cost as much as a small house. And let's not forget that knights had to be absolutely ruthless in battle. If you're picturing the noble duel, forget it. Medieval warfare was brutal. Imagine being encased in iron, swinging a sword until your muscles burned, smashing skulls and crushing ribs, surrounded by the stench of blood and sweat. There was no glamour, only survival. Think of it as office politics, but with battle axes. The clergy, power and piety. The clergy, they were the ones you went to when you needed your sins forgiven. But let's not kid ourselves. The church was every bit as political as the nobles, and sometimes worse. If you were a bishop or archbishop, you had land, wealth, and power that rivaled the king's. The pope, of course, could wield power with the threat of excommunication, essentially turning people into social pariahs. The medieval church was not just a spiritual institution, it was a massive, wealthy entity with vast land holdings. Imagine a mega corporation with the moral high ground. And if you were high clergy, you weren't a humble servant of God. You were a politician, often born into nobility, with all the backstabbing and scheming that came with it. The lower clergy, such as priests, monks, and nuns, were a different story. They lived simpler lives, often secluded in monasteries, copying manuscripts and praying for the world's sins. But make no mistake, the power of the church loomed over everyone like a dark cloud, always reminding the masses that hell was real, and the clergy were the gatekeepers to salvation. Merchants, the gold diggers of the late Middle Ages. If there was one class that flipped the bird to the feudal system, it was these guys. Unlike the nobles and knights who lived by land and title, the merchants were all about the money, and they got plenty of it as Europe slowly crawled into the era of trade and commerce. A good merchant could become wealthier than some nobles, and they weren't bound by the same obligations. While the nobles fought for land, the merchants fought for markets. They were like medieval startup founders, risky, innovative, and hated by the traditional elite. They traveled vast distances, trading spices, silk, and anything else that could turn a profit. Their wealth came from an unlikely source, towns. Medieval towns were hotbeds of trade, and the merchant class thrived there. But life wasn't easy. Roads were dangerous, filled with thieves and bandits, and rival merchants often played dirty. They were gamblers, hustling through a volatile economy where a bad deal could sink your entire business faster than you could say Guildhall. But for those who made it, the rewards were extraordinary. Artisans and craftsmen, gilded survivors. The artisans and craftsmen were the skilled laborers who made the medieval world go round. They built the castles, forged the weapons, and stitched the clothes. They were organized into guilds, which were part trade union, part mafia. The guilds set prices, maintained quality control, and fiercely protected their trade secrets. If you wanted to become a blacksmith, you couldn't just start hammering iron. You had to apprentice for years, learning the craft before the guild even considered letting you in. Being an artisan was no easy life. While they had some degree of independence, they were still at the mercy of the nobles and merchants who bought their goods. They lived in cramped, noisy cities where disease spread like wildfire. The medieval artisan was a far cry from the romantic image of the craftsman quietly working in his shop. Instead, think of a medieval sweatshop full of noise, sweat, and hard labor. But they did what they could. After all, not everyone was born a lord. Peasants and serfs, the human cogs in the feudal machine. If medieval society was a house, these were the foundations that everyone else trampled on. Over 90% of the population were peasants, and most of them were serfs, tied to the land like living property. They worked the fields from dawn till dusk, providing food and labor in exchange for protection from their lord. The air quotes are necessary because most of the time, that protection was theoretical at best. To be a peasant was to live in a world of mud and toil. Their lives were a relentless cycle of planting, harvesting, and paying taxes. If the crops failed, you starved. If war came, you were drafted. If disease swept through, you died. No doctors, no medicine, just prayers and herbs that worked as well as a medieval iPhone. The worst part, you couldn't leave. Serfs were legally bound to the land, which meant that no matter how terrible things got, escape was almost impossible. It was a life sentence without the crime. You worked your entire life for a lord who barely knew your name, and at the end, you died as you lived, poor, hungry, and forgotten. The medieval peasant's world was small, brutal, and unforgiving. If there was ever a metaphor for the dark side of feudalism, it was the serf's existence. Jesters, more than clowns. Jesters, with their vibrant outfits and sharp wit, held a unique role in medieval society. Far from being mere clowns, they were masterful entertainers and clever satirists who could mock kings, nobles, and even the daily life of peasants. In a world where crossing the line with authority could cost you your head, jesters had the rare privilege of speaking uncomfortable truths, often veiled in humor and satire, without immediate consequence. Their humor served as a tool for diffusing tension and offering a reflection of the absurdities of the ruling class. However, jesters were always walking a razor's edge. While their jests could be biting, they were also one ill-timed or poorly received joke away from their demise. What one king found amusing, another might find insulting, and the consequences could be deadly. This precarious balance made them both insiders and outsiders within royal courts. They entertained, they critiqued, but they always had to gauge the room with precision, knowing that their safety depended on how well their humor was received. Jesters could be found in both royal courts and public spaces, speaking to all classes of society. Yet despite their mobility, they constantly faced the reality that laughter was their shield and their only defense. If this narrative resonated with you, do support us. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe. Thank you for staying with us to the end. See you in the next video on Plaid Chronicles.